Thank you everyone for joining. I'm excited to talk about this topic. I'm very passionate about how we can help elevate people in the workplace and around the world. That's our mission here at Immersion, is closing the global communication gap and helping people have better employment opportunities. So I'd like to get started with a poll. Which would you say is the most difficult part of your hiring process? So there's a few. I'll give some time for you to look at the answers and engage. As we talk with companies who are hiring all over the globe, we typically hear one of these four reasons. Not receiving enough applicants, receiving too many applicants and the time it takes to filter through the right ones, the hiring process that you're currently employing and needing to screen and make sure you have the right applicants is too long, or applicants are getting through the screening process. Sometimes the screening is not well enough, and they're not they don't have the right capabilities or qualifications. So I'll give a little bit of time. This is interesting. Okay. What I find is interesting and is pretty typical when I do these different types of presentations is no one has answered too many applicants. Wouldn't it be nice to live in a world in 2021 where we were flooded with quality applicants and that wasn't a problem? But we all know that that's not the case. Not receiving enough applicants is really the trend that we're seeing most. With some pieces, I think that could derive to that. The hiring process being too long potentially can be a part of that. This is really interesting results. It's a little bit more skewed than I've seen in other places, but I appreciate you sharing your thoughts. Well, this is fantastic. I appreciate everyone engaging with this. As we go forward, the purpose of this presentation is specifically focusing on companies that have a multilingual workforce. And I want to put a little bit of a plug. If you don't have a multilingual workforce now, the odds of you and other companies in the next few years having others join your team who are not native speakers of the language of your company, which is probably English, is very high. As many people are recognizing and seeing since the pandemic and since COVID-19, the barriers to entry are completely changing for a lot of companies. As we move to more remote work, as we learn to be more efficient, to work with people all over the globe, the pool of talent is going to extend beyond borders. And as that does, the importance of solid communication within a company is going to rise. And so many of you may already be feeling this pain and may understand the importance of making sure that those you work with are certified and able to communicate in the language. And those of you who are just embarking on this, you might have questions about, well, what is the best way for us to do a screening process that then evaluates someone's communication ability for either a customer-facing or an internal-facing role where language is important. So there's a few things that I think are really important to understand as we're going to go into a few specific use cases from companies that we work with who have experienced significant pain regarding language testing and the screening process for new applicants, and who have found ways to use automated language testing to solve those pains. Before I get into that, Forbes in a recent study showed that 65% of US organizations can attribute inefficiency to language barriers in their workplace. So as I mentioned, this is already a problem that will grow if there's not solid solutions put in place for both the certification and the reskilling and upskilling of employees for language ability. Additionally, customer experience is becoming the #1 competitive advantage and differentiator for companies. In a recent study, 2/3 of companies surveyed said that they compete mostly on the basis of customer experience, and 81% of them expect to be competing on the basis of customer experience in 2 years' time. So it's not enough to have a solid product or a solid service, a solid team, or good and attractive pricing. the market now is really demanding good customer experience. And consumers, whether they're individual consumers or buyers for businesses, are expecting to have great experience for the partners that they bring in. And if the experience doesn't meet a threshold, even if there are other alluring factors like superior product or service, these companies aren't going to be satisfied. So that's something to really keep in mind. To what degree does language ability and screening for language ability affect customer experience and customer service? It's one of the leading factors in terms of companies that have a multilingual workforce. And then additionally, there's a huge retention benefit for customers and companies that focus on language screening and language upskilling and reskilling. One of the most important factors for people predicting turnover is that in a survey, this is by the Harvard Business Review, they found that the strong social support reduces the risk of turnover by about 24%. And social support in these settings, especially for a multilingual workforce, means helping them become engaged with their team, helping them feel a sense of belonging, and being able to make sure that those coming in have no communication barriers is a huge impact to their sense of belonging and engagement. So hopefully that sets the scene a little bit for some of the highest level impacts that you can expect to receive and to impact as you strengthen your ability to certify and to upskill and reskill for language ability. Most of the groups that we work with, you'd think, we're a software company, we're an automated solution. We often, when we talk to people who are interested in this problem or looking for solutions, they're not looking at other software solutions. Most of them are comparing the value to a process that they've developed internally, which is typically someone in their HR team or someone on their recruiting team who has the task of rating for language. And so they'll do human interviews. Sometimes there's companies that go to the expense of using third-party human raters. A lot of them, as I mentioned, hire them in-house. This may sound familiar to you. There's a challenge that, as we've talked to a lot of companies in this space, experience when they're using a system of human rating. The interviews take time. And oftentimes, depending on how your process is set up, the time between conducting the interview to the person conducting the interview completing the rating using whatever rubric to getting that in a system where it can be used and managed takes a lot of time, sometimes up to 48 hours. Especially longer if you're using a third-party service because there's a communication back and forth. As good as we try to be as humans, assessment was never one of our fortes. The inconsistency is really hard to overcome. It takes a lot of training, and especially if you have a large enough process where you're having multiple people who are conducting these ratings, getting people to rate on the same scale and to be consistent in their ratings is very, very time consuming and difficult. It's really hard for humans to do. The other potential challenge that we've heard from other companies is as they do this system, especially if they have a smaller number of those who are qualified or able to do these language ratings, they can only schedule one at a time. And so in a lot of companies, it'd be nice if there were a nice, predictable, steady stream of hires that need to be made. And in those cases, you might be able to plan for how you can funnel them through maybe a bottleneck of a human rater. But that's sadly not the case in most companies we work with. A lot of times there's huge needs to hire a lot of people very quickly due to certain demands of the business. And when there's only one interviewer, then scalability and scheduling with that time becomes a huge bottleneck and barrier to bringing in the qualified people. So we're going to go over 3 specific use cases of companies who really felt this pain and what they were able to accomplish as they looked at their language evaluation system and as they considered how they can automate it. So the first use case I want to mention is a company called the Office Gurus. So this is a company in Latin America. It's a call center. They focus on providing agents who can typically hop on the phone, but they have an omni-channel solution. So sometimes it's on chat or email, who provide support to primarily English-speaking companies. And most of the agents that they hire are non-native English speakers. And so there's a huge need for their workforce to come in to speak the language in order to perform the job. So as they understood that need, they looked around for what resources they could use to solve the problem. And what they found is a company nearby that offered a third-party rating system. But part of the problem was the system was they would record a video of the candidates answering a prompt. They would send that video via email, so not in any sort of secure channel, to this rater. The rating company would then, in somewhat of a black box fashion, rate the assessment, give it a score from 1 to 5, and respond back via that same email, so an individual email for each candidate, what the rating was. And they would internalize that and put that into their system and use that to make decisions. As you can probably imagine, there were a lot of issues and problems that they started encountering as they were using the system. First of all, the black box rating that was coming from the human rating system was not clear. And at some cases, it didn't necessarily seem like it was predictive of good performance. They found that many of the top performers scored relatively mid-range or sometimes low on the evaluations, but they still were able to let them through. And then some that scored really high didn't end up being their top performers and ended up churning out. And so if the language evaluation center isn't actually predicting performance for the job, then you have to question what value it's actually playing in the screening process. The other thing that they were running into is at some point, the employees themselves and the candidates began to be concerned with the fairness of the system that they were using. They felt like, especially since this system was used for hiring, but also for raises and promotions, that they weren't being given a fair consideration and chance because the ratings didn't seem to be fair and reliable, which has a huge impact on employee morale if they don't feel like they're being treated fairly. So that's one company that experienced some specific, they had a huge need for language evaluation, and they were experiencing these problems of the subjective language evaluations that often accompany using human raters. Another one is a company called Armatus. They also were hiring and using a third-party local company, and they're another BPO or call center who's hiring reps to serve their clients to support people typically in English-speaking countries. Their problem was they liked the rating. They felt like their external partner was pretty good at using a solid rubric, and that the ratings that were coming back were quality, and that they actually were predictive and representative of the candidate's language ability. The problem that they had is oftentimes when trying to schedule for one of these appointments, they had to leave that up to the candidate. And so the candidate themselves would need to go on to a scheduling system for their third-party raters in order to schedule when the rating would happen. And sometimes that would take up to 1 or 2 days to even get scheduled. And once it was scheduled, it would still take a period of time, sometimes another day or two, until the results were sent back. And so in a time, as you all mentioned, we're not getting enough applicants. The time to hire is a crucial component of making sure that we capture the top talent. And if you're having to wait 3 days, up to 72 hours in order to get vital information back to move forward in the hiring process, the chances are, if that applicant is applying to other positions, they may have already been snatched up or offered a position somewhere else. And especially for some of these positions, they don't yet have the company or the brand loyalty that will help them make an informed decision about which place do I want to work for. So being able to offer the position very quickly and then show them why your company and your brand is the right place to work is typically the order that you need in order to secure top talent. And so they were losing applicants left and right. And especially for them, I mentioned the lumpiness of hiring. They would often have ramp-up periods where they needed to hire a couple hundred people within a period of 1 or 2 weeks. And with this process, they simply couldn't do it. The bottlenecks and the non-scalability of the human ratings did not lend well to them being able to to screen that high number of applicants. And so they had to go with their gut decisions or sometimes push people forward without really being able to screen for the language ability here. So another company, Focus Services. So their specific problem is a lot of their clients, and these are, again, for company and customer-facing roles, their clients were expecting an answer when they were fulfilling RFPs, when they were working for contracts for new clients or for new projects. Their clients were expecting an answer saying, hey, we know that you have a multilingual workforce. What are you doing to ensure that those of your agents who are going to be interacting with our customers are qualified and are certified to do that? And before they were able to implement an automated process, they always felt inadequate in answering that question. And it was a part of the RFP process that they always had to kind of skirt around. And again, as I mentioned, depending on what industry your company is in, whether or not you deal with this problem now, the likelihood of you dealing with it in the future as the global talent pool becomes more and more available through remote work is high. And so having an answer for your customers and clients of how you deal and certify language ability is going to become increasingly important in the sales and customer satisfaction process. So technology is fantastic. It doesn't solve all problems. Technology isn't replacing humans. But as I mentioned before, assessment is typically not one of our strengths as humans. We're easily swayed, we're biased, and it takes a lot of effort for us to learn how to do these types of ratings and evaluations consistently. So being able to employ technology in a very strong predictive manner actually enables us as humans to do what we're better suited to do. And it takes that piece off of our head and helps us have better focus. And so I want to walk through those same pains and problems that I presented and talk about as these companies found and started using an automated approach to language assessment in their pre-screening and in their employee skilling and upskilling, how they were able to overcome the pains that they felt. And so again, you may be thinking about pains or problems that you're currently facing with a multilingual workforce. You may be thinking ahead to, as you expand into this area, how you can get ahead of a lot of these pains and avoid some of the problems that we discussed for some of these companies in the last few slides. So again, the office gurus, their problem primarily was the subjective nature of the evaluations, not knowing how it was happening, not having it happen on a consistent and fair basis, and having that really affect both the predictability of their outcomes for those who could do the job, but also employee morale, which then started to really affect turnover and employee churn. And so as they began using an objective, unbiased solution, a solution that rates the same every time because technology doesn't get tired and technology doesn't decide to change the rules if they're in a bad mood. And being able to get immediate and accurate results really was the game changer for them. So they were able to be a lot more consistent in terms of those they were hiring that were meeting their performance demands. And in turn, one of the most important outcomes that they were able to report was an increased retention of up to 20%. And so there was qualitative information from their employees about how the trust in the system was far greater. It wasn't a black box anymore, but there was actual transparency in terms of what the system was doing and how it was giving the language evaluation ratings. And trust that using automation and AI was happening consistent with every applicant over time. The worst thing that you want is for employees to question whether there's something unfair about the process. And even worse than that is if it starts to bleed into an area of diversity or protected classes in terms of bias and discrimination. So being able to show that the computer doesn't care, doesn't know about your socioeconomic status and other areas, it's able to rate consistently every time. On the case of Armatus, so their problem was the lumpiness of hiring and the time it took to extend an offer to these employees that were coming in. As I mentioned before, when a lot of times, especially in these areas where you might be hiring for customer service, the level of that job means the person's primary motivation is to get a job and to start getting a reliable paycheck. They're not yet to the point where they feel like they can be picky and choosy to work for the right company or a company that has a better culture. And so it's imperative that as a company with people that have so many different options of where to work, that you're able to do the evaluation and screening process quickly and extend the offer so that you're in the running. So here, a 15-minute AI language-based assessment with immediate results took that 72-hour window for this company and was able to shorten it to 15 minutes. So for the language portion of the screening, it was very rapid. And this turned into them being able to extend same-day offers in many cases, and especially in the cases for them where they had huge hiring frenzies in order to ramp up for specific client demands. So being able in those areas to extend an offer without having to sacrifice their process, without having to make compromises in terms of how they're doing the rating and the language screening was a game changer for them. And then thirdly, we talked about focus services. A lot of their problem was the satisfaction of their clients. They were hearing more and more that their clients were specifically asking the question, how are you certifying and proving the language ability of your employees? And again, as I mentioned in the beginning, as more and more companies are looking and seeing that the quality differentiator that's really going to win in the future is customer experience. Being able to deliver a solid customer experience from every single one of your employees is imperative. And in many cases where the pool of people who are going to be interfacing with customers will increasingly come from people who don't have native language ability in the language of the customer, the ability to screen for language ability and to help upskill and reskill for that is imperative. And it's going to be more and more of a differentiator and a sticking point for clients as they work with you and your company. So having a reliable assessment with objective results is a huge selling tool in order to differentiate your products and services. So knowing that you have a robust and a fair and an effective system in place to make sure that every single person who's going to be interfacing with customers has a certain level of language ability really satisfies those demands. And increasing client satisfaction, again, is the way to really gain a competitive edge. So just as an overview, we mentioned some of the challenges that companies are facing as they're implementing human raters, whether that's internal or whether they're using an outside service to help with that. In a lot of cases where it takes 30 to 60 minutes to have an interview in order to get a feel for how well someone can speak a language, that can be translated into a 15-minute test that can be taken anytime, anywhere, on any device. So the accessibility, especially in areas where, maybe 2 years ago, the hiring process could have been more controlled, it could have been more in-house, you could have had a lot more in office or on premises applications, that's completely changed. So having the ability to let your candidates interact with your screening tools from anywhere, anytime, again, is where the world is going, but it also increases your ability to extend offers quickly and to do so without having to sacrifice or compromise on the values that are important to you in screening for your applicants. Next, the time it takes to get the results, and not only the time, but also the actions that it takes. So something that a lot of companies don't, or I think I would say they underestimate, is while the language interview itself takes time, it almost takes just as much, if not more time, for scheduling and for inputting the information about the language interview into a system where it can be used. So a lot of companies that use an applicant tracking system or any other process as they're going through the candidate experience and they're checking the boxes as they see if the candidate is qualified for a job, being able to more quickly and more automatedly integrate the evaluations from the various screening steps saves a ton of time and hassle. And it also removes the potential for human error. So at any time that you have a human involved in a process, it comes with the possibility of making a mistake. Even despite the best training that we can have or the best people, that happens. And so finding areas where you can automate the process and you can really ensure a consistent level of accuracy helps simplify the process and helps, again, humans be able to focus on the areas where they're particularly needed and the types of assessments where really a human needs to understand the abilities of a candidate. So instead of a human who doesn't consider themselves a language evaluation expert, but has to do this because it's one of the boxes they need to check, if you're able to use a system that can check that box while you're able to focus on the particular job requirements or other qualitative things that are predictive for this person's performance, you can spend your mind share on that and help you become more effective in the other areas in the screening process. The other issue that we're seeing, and this is especially with companies as they grow, they may be able to have a single person who learns and takes the time to be as consistent as possible, as accurate as possible in the language rating process. However, as the company grows and as that person, as I mentioned before, with the scalability matters, becomes a bottleneck, often they say, well, let's hire somebody else, or let's get someone else who can duplicate and replicate this process so that we can now extend the language evaluations to a growing candidate base and we can make more hires. A lot of the problem then is the consistency that now exists between two raters, and this is just magnified with every rater that comes in. That starts to then require frequent collaboration and communication between the raters to make sure that they're using a similar set of results to make sure that the hiring process across locations or across departments is remaining fair, and you're not having one rater who's scoring on a different set of skills than another. And so not only does that require training and the time to train for those raters, but it also requires a really in-depth process. And focusing on that process isn't what your company is necessarily about. So being able to use and leverage a system that is scalable, that applies the same process for all employees, regardless of how many and regardless of how many locations you need to do this at, knowing that that rating that's coming out is consistent, then allows you to put your mind share and your people's mind share on the unique problems of your company. And finally, at the bottom, the expense that we've talked about, there were several things we've talked about where you have multiple raters, where you're having to bring them together, where you're having to invest in process, where you're having to figure out how to put ratings into an applicant tracking system, not to mention the rating and the time it takes to do the rating itself. The costs add up. And again, using your resources at your company to fulfill its unique needs of things that are predictive is really important. And oftentimes using technology, one of the benefits is once you have a process in place, the incremental cost of technology is typically far lower than even the most fine-tuned or streamlined human processes. And so there's a lot of advantages as you're thinking about how we can be better, how we can receive better outcomes as we're working with candidates that have a multilingual background for considering technology and automation in order to do that process. So briefly, I mentioned this in the beginning, immersion exists for the sole purpose of proving language ability and certifying the language ability of your team. We believe that by doing so, we help people unlock better opportunities. I'm really excited personally for the trend that is happening around the world where people in underprivileged or underserviced locations who have particular skills, specifically with language, are now going to be given access to better employment opportunities. And I think they'll be able to bless the lives of themselves and their families by having this greater access to jobs. And these are the same people that can come into your organizations and can really make a huge difference and a huge impact. And we're excited to be riding that wave and helping companies as they transition into using a multilingual workforce, ensure that their screening processes are solid and in place and predicting the outcomes that you expect as a company. So thank you. Some of the next steps for you, we talk a lot about the hiring process evaluation checklist. Things like, how long does your hiring process take? Are you screening for language ability? And if so, how are you doing that? And is it accurate? And at what stage or what place in the funnel, depending on your industry or your particular needs, should you be inserting language evaluation? Should it be a top of funnel screener that then additional qualifications follow after you have that? Or should it be a middle of the funnel decision making point if it's not necessarily the crucial aspect for your hiring decision, but it's an informative aspect, and that can help set a different trajectory for this candidate. Go ahead and there's a QR code. You can reach out to me afterwards. You can download this guide to have more information. But I want to thank you all for your time and for listening and being on the forefront of a lot of the multilingual hiring trend that's happening.
Dr. Jacob Burdis, thank you so much for taking us through the presentation and sharing both what immersion does and the overall challenges that are associated with using technology in this way. Fascinating presentation. If you folks have questions for Jacob, he's going to be in a colleague cafe coming up here in just a couple of minutes at 12:20 Eastern time, which is 4 minutes from now. I will ask one question since we have a couple of minutes, if you don't mind, Jacob, which is, as you think about the idea of predictive analytics or predictive technologies being able to help make better decisions, which I'm fully sold on, and I think probably most of the folks in the audience are, there's this black box tendency, though. So I think probably for some hiring managers that might be thinking, wow, I would have chosen that other person versus this one that a software algorithm is telling me to get. How do you help them get past knowing what's in the box, so to speak?
Yeah, I love that question. I am a huge believer in visibility and transparency, period, in general, but especially in this aspect. So one of the things that we highlight as a company is every single time that we have a new innovation, a new assessment, a new way to predict, like you said, we accompany it with a public-facing white paper that really goes into the specifics of the psychometrics. And when you're evaluating, especially automated or AI-based solution tools, whether it's language or anything else, I think one of the first questions that you should be asking is, what was the calibration pool? Because automation and AI is only as good as the data points that it pulls from in order to set up the algorithms. And so one of the things I mentioned is discrimination and bias. One of the questions you should ask is, have you considered your calibration pool in terms of, is it as a representative sample of those that we're going to be applying it against? Because if you're taking the calibration pool and you're just starting with one particular use case, there may be inherent bias that then bleeds into the algorithm just because you didn't do what research requires you to do in terms of having a solid insights that's representative of the sample. So I think that's huge. When you're considering different solutions or providers, ask for that, and ask for the papers and the data that show that the process, the psychometric process of the calibration and then turning those calibrations into the algorithms that actually predict do follow best practices.